My name is Clarice Mendez, and I'm 58 years old. The night my husband burned down everything I'd spent my life building, I didn't collapse, I watched. The fire that was meant to erase me became the moment I was reborn. He thought those flames would leave me broken, but they only forged something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. And when I rose from his ashes, he was there to watch it happen. For most of my life, my world revolved around color brushstrokes, textures, and the smell of oil paint that clung to my hands. My art studio wasn't just a building, it was my sanctuary. I started it with nothing but a few secondhand canvases, a cheap set of brushes, and a dream that refused to die even when everything else in life tried to. Over 2 decades, that little studio became a place where people came not just to buy art, but to feel something again. Derek, my husband, used to call it my happy place. He'd smile and tell me how proud he was. Back then, I believed him. I believed every soft word, every gesture of affection. For years, I thought we were a team that he stood beside me as I carved my name into the art world one piece at a time. But somewhere along the line, something shifted in him. Maybe it was the growing number of clients who sought me out instead of him. Maybe it was the whispers he heard at parties, people admiring my talent more than his business ventures. I don't know exactly when admiration turned into resentment, but I felt it long before I could prove it. It began with small things. He'd scoff at my schedules, mock the hours I spent perfecting each piece, and joke that I shouldn't take myself too seriously. Then his jokes turned into comments that cut a little deeper: how I was too old to be chasing dreams, how no one cared about middle-aged art, how a woman's success could make a man look weak. I brushed it off, pretending his words didn't sting, but the bitterness in his tone started to leave marks invisible to everyone but me. The night before it happened, we had one of those arguments that stick to your skin like smoke. He said something I'll never forget: "No woman should outshine her man, Clarice." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and sharp. I remember looking at him and realizing I didn't recognize the man standing in front of me anymore. There was something cold in his eyes, something that made me want to step back. But I didn't. I just turned away, too tired to fight, too proud to beg for understanding. That night, I went to bed restless. The wind outside was strong, brushing against the windows, and the air felt too still inside the house. I remember staring at the ceiling, listening to Derek's slow, steady breathing beside me, and wondering when love had turned into something dangerous. Then came the smell of smoke. At first, I thought I was dreaming, a faint, acrid scent that barely touched my nose. But, within seconds, it thickened. I bolted upright, my heart pounding, and saw an orange glow flickering through the curtains. I ran to the window, and my stomach dropped. My studio, my life's work, was engulfed in flames. The fire moved fast, devouring everything I had built piece by piece. The next few hours blurred together: the sirens, the shouting, the neighbors gathering in their robes. I stood there barefoot on the driveway, shaking, staring at the collapsing roof. Derek had his arm around me, murmuring words I couldn't hear. He told the police it must have been faulty wiring, an accident waiting to happen. But I knew better. There was something in the way he spoke, too calm, too rehearsed. When he thought I wasn't looking, I saw the corner of his mouth twitch upward, a smirk that chilled me more than the cold night air. When the fire trucks finally left, I walked closer to the wreckage. The air was heavy with ash and silence. My paintings, my memories, were nothing but fragments of color floating in soot. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I just stood there, feeling something inside me hollow out. My dreams were gone, and with them, the woman I used to be. Derek tried to comfort me, his arm slipping around my shoulders again, but his touch felt foreign. That was the moment I realized I wasn't broken. I was reborn. My grief was just smoke clearing from a deeper fire inside me, one he didn't know he had started. I stared at the ashes until dawn, whispering to myself a silent promise. If he thought he could burn my dreams, he hadn't seen what I could build from the ruins. I didn't know it then, but the first spark of my revenge had already been lit. Grief turned me hollow, but anger filled the cracks. In the days after the fire, everything around me moved in slow motion. The smell of smoke lingered in my hair and my clothes, and no matter how many showers I took, it clung to me like a cruel reminder. I spent hours on the phone with insurance agents, answering the same questions over and over. When was the last electrical inspection? Did I have security cameras? Had I noticed anything unusual? Each call chipped away at my patience. Every official-sounding voice told me it was just a tragic accident, but their sympathy felt like salt on an open wound. The pitying looks from friends didn't help either. They'd visit with casseroles and empty words, eyes darting away when I didn't cry the way they expected me to. They thought I was in shock. They were wrong. I wasn't numb. I was waiting. Derek, on the other hand, acted as though he'd already moved on. He started talking about selling the property before the ashes had even cooled. He said it would help us rebuild faster, that there was no point holding on to memories we couldn't bring back. I listened quietly, pretending to agree, while every word from his mouth made my stomach turn. He wasn't grieving. He was planning. His eagerness to cash out felt too unnatural, too rehearsed. When he spoke about insurance claims, there was a glint in his eye that didn't belong to a man who'd lost everything. It belonged to someone who had gained something. That suspicion grew heavy in my chest. I tried to push it away, tried to believe I was imagining things, grief making me paranoid, but deep down I knew better. Derek was hiding something, and I couldn't let that truth stay buried. One afternoon, while he was at work, I went to the insurance company myself. The receptionist recognized my name and gave me a soft, apologetic smile before directing me to a representative. I pretended to be following up on paperwork, just an anxious wife wanting to ensure everything was in order. The man handed me a copy of our policy, flipping through the pages casually. That's when I saw it. A small handwritten note on the margin of one page, policy adjusted, coverage increased. The date was circled just 2 weeks before the fire. My pulse thundered in my ears. My hand trembled as I traced the numbers. The new payout was almost double what it used to be. I stared at that page as the truth slammed into me. Derek had planned this. My husband, the man who promised to protect me, had set the stage for my ruin. My throat tightened, but I swallowed the scream that wanted to escape. If I let emotion take over now, I'd lose the upper hand. So I smiled, thanked the representative, and walked out like nothing had happened. But inside, something cracked wide open. When I got home, I looked at Derek differently. Every smile, every word, every casual touch, suddenly it all felt like a performance I'd been watching blindfolded. He came home that evening with takeout and a grin, saying he'd spoken to a real estate agent about the property. I laughed softly, pretending not to notice how his voice shook when I asked for details. He didn't suspect that I already knew. That ignorance was going to be my advantage. I started, keeping notes in a small leather-bound journal. Dates, conversations, his phone calls, anything that felt off. I bought a tiny voice recorder and hid it behind the framed photo of our wedding on the bookshelf. Every night, I'd sit across from him at dinner, smiling while secretly recording everything he said. He rambled about his failed investments, his frustrations at work, and how maybe the fire was a blessing in disguise. I bit my tongue until it bled, keeping my anger buried beneath a trembling smile. In public, I was still the grieving wife. I wore black, spoke softly, and played the role of a woman broken by tragedy. But inside, I was rebuilding myself piece by piece. The old Clarice, the one who trusted too easily, who forgave too quickly, had died in that fire. What remained was someone sharper, quieter, and far more dangerous. There were nights when I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection, trying to recognize the woman staring back. My face looked older, somehow, harder. I missed the softness I used to have. But I knew softness was a luxury I could no longer afford. Every time Derek kissed my forehead, every time he told me we'd get through this together, I wanted to scream that I knew what he'd done. But I couldn't, not yet. Revenge isn't born out of anger alone. It needs patience. It needs precision, and I had both. Weeks turned into months. I became a master of disguise, perfecting the art of pretense. I laughed at his jokes, helped him with his paperwork, even thanked him for being so supportive. All the while, I studied him like a subject in one of my old paintings, every detail, every flaw, every shadow he thought he'd hidden. The more I watched, the more I realized how predictable he really was. Derek loved control, and as long as he thought he had it, he wouldn't see the storm gathering beneath his feet. Sometimes I wondered what had driven him to it. Was it greed, insecurity, Or had he simply wanted to destroy something that reminded him of his own failures? I stopped asking those questions when I realized it didn't matter. Whatever his reason, he'd set fire to more than just my studio. He'd burned away the last pieces of the woman who once loved him. And in her place, someone else had emerged. Someone who didn't weep, didn't beg, didn't trust. Someone who would wait for the perfect moment to strike. The day I discovered the key piece of evidence, everything changed. I wasn't Derek's wife anymore. I wasn't his partner or his victim. I was his reckoning. Sometimes the truth hides in plain sight right inside your husband's desk drawer. That night, the house was quiet. The kind of stillness that feels almost rehearsed. Derek was in the shower, humming to himself, completely unaware that the woman sitting in the living room was about to uncover the final proof of his betrayal. I had spent weeks watching him, memorizing his patterns, waiting for the perfect moment. His office door had always been off limits, locked when he wasn't home. But lately, he had grown careless. He trusted me again, or maybe he just thought I'd given up. Either way, his arrogance was my invitation. I slipped inside his office with my heart pounding so hard I could hear it echo in my ears. The smell of his cologne lingered in the air, mixed with the faint scent of burnt paper that never failed to remind me of what he'd taken from me. The desk stood in the corner, heavy and imposing, as if guarding its secrets. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened the first drawer, rifling through bills, receipts, and the usual clutter of forgotten documents. Nothing. Then the second drawer, old photos, tax records, property deeds. Still nothing. It was the last drawer that caught my eye, the one labeled House Maintenance. It looked too ordinary, too convenient. I pulled it open and froze. Beneath a pile of old service receipts was a thin folder, crisp and new. My pulse quickened as I slid it out and flipped it open. There it was, the insurance file. His signature, bold and familiar, sprawled across the bottom of every page. I turned each sheet slowly, feeling the air grow colder with every paragraph. Adjustments to the policy, increased coverage, changes to the beneficiary details, all approved 2 weeks before the fire. My hands felt like ice. The evidence was right there, staring back at me, mocking the years I'd spent loving him. Then, I saw the emails. Printed copies, stapled together, almost as if he'd wanted to keep a trophy of his deceit. Conversations between him and the insurance adjuster, coded in careful language, yet damningly clear. One line sent a chill down my spine. "We'll finalize everything after the incident." After the incident. Those 3 words sliced through me like a blade. He hadn't just planned the fire, he'd anticipated it, calculated it, even documented it. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My throat tightened, my hands shook, and I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady myself. I wanted to scream, to storm into the bathroom and throw those papers in his face. But then another part of me, the calmer, colder version that had been born the night of the fire, took control. I pulled out my phone, snapped photos of every page, and sent them to a hidden email account I'd created under a false name. Every document, every lie, preserved safely in digital form. If Derek ever tried to destroy me again, I'd have everything I needed to destroy him first. When I was done, I returned the folder to its place exactly as I'd found it. Every angle, every paper, perfect. He would never know I'd been there. I stepped out of his office just as the shower stopped. My heart raced, but my face remained calm as I returned to the couch, picking up a magazine I wasn't actually reading. A few minutes later, he walked into the room, towel around his waist, smiling as if nothing in the world could touch him. "You're still up?" he asked. I nodded, pretending fatigue. He kissed the top of my head and went upstairs. I watched him go, feeling an eerie kind of calm settle over me. That night, lying beside him in bed, I stared at the ceiling while he slept peacefully. I could hear his steady breathing, that same sound that used to comfort me. Now it made my skin crawl. Every rise and fall of his chest was a reminder that I was sharing my bed with a man who had tried to erase me. I turned to look at him, the man who'd burned my studio, my dream, my identity, and I realized that I no longer hated him. Hatred gives power to the other person. What I felt was far more dangerous. I felt resolve. For a long time, I thought about going to the police. I imagined handing over the documents, watching as they led him away in handcuffs. But that would have been too merciful, too easy. Jail would only cage him for a while. I wanted something permanent. A life sentence not behind bars, but within his own failure. I didn't want him gone. I wanted him to watch me rise. That decision became the turning point. I no longer cared about what I'd lost. I cared about what I was going to build. I started researching quietly at night while he slept. I read about business loans, startup grants, and mentorship programs for women rebuilding after loss. I devoured success stories, bookmarked contacts, and created a plan that would take months to set in motion. Every keystroke, every late-night search was a declaration. I would rebuild, but not just for survival. I would build to dominate. Derek had no idea that the woman lying next to him was planning a resurrection. Each morning, I made his coffee, smiled at his jokes, and went through the motions of a normal life. Inside, I was designing my revenge, not through destruction, but creation. I didn't need to burn him the way he'd burned me. I would let him choke on his own envy when he realized he'd created the very fire that forged me. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between us became something tangible, something that buzzed in the air. He didn't notice how quiet I'd become, how detached my smiles were. He thought he'd broken me, but he couldn't see the woman forming beneath the ashes. I became meticulous, learning the language of contracts, investments, and ownership. My art had taught me patience and precision skills that now served me in a much darker craft. Sometimes, when he'd leave for work, I'd walk past the charred remains of my old studio and imagine what would stand there one day. I didn't see ruins anymore. I saw blueprints. I saw glass, light, and strength. Every brick I would lay in the future would be a monument to what he'd underestimated. I no longer saw myself as his wife. That title had died the night of the fire. I was something else now, the architect of my own revenge, the author of his downfall. And just when I thought my plan would take years to set in motion, the phone rang one evening. A familiar voice from my past spoke through the receiver, soft yet electrifying. An old friend offering an unexpected opportunity, one that could change everything. I didn't know it yet, but that call was the first step toward rebuilding not just my career, but my empire. When opportunity knocks, even ashes can turn to gold. I remember that morning vividly. The sun had just begun to filter through the kitchen blinds, turning the dust in the air into strands of light. Derek was still asleep upstairs, snoring faintly, while I sat at the table with my laptop open, pretending to scroll through emails. My mind wasn't really there. It was still stuck on the folder in his desk, the proof of what he'd done. I had the evidence, the rage, and the plan forming quietly inside me, but I didn't yet have the means to execute it. That's when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, but that single decision changed everything. Clarice? It's Naomi. Naomi Hart. The name pulled me out of my fog immediately. Naomi had been my college roommate, the one with wild curls, big dreams, and an even bigger heart. We'd lost touch over the years, life pulling us in different directions. I hadn't heard her voice in more than 20 years, yet it sounded exactly as I remembered, warm, confident, full of life. She said she'd read about the fire in a local paper and wanted to reach out. Her tone was gentle, not pitying, and that alone made me listen longer than I usually would. Then she said the words that made my pulse quicken. I think I might have something for you. Naomi had built an interior design firm from scratch, one that had recently expanded into corporate spaces and luxury homes. She was looking for a creative director, someone with vision, leadership, and an eye for transformation. You were always the most talented designer in our class, she said. You can turn anything broken into something breathtaking. That's exactly what I need. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I hadn't worked under anyone in years, and the thought of starting again felt almost humiliating. But I also knew I couldn't stay in the shadows forever. I needed a path back into the world I loved, one where Derek couldn't follow. That night, I sat in silence long after Derek had gone to bed. His whiskey glass still sat half full on the coffee table, the air heavy with the scent of alcohol and arrogance. He had no idea that I'd already begun plotting my escape. The offer from Naomi felt like a rope being lowered into the pit I'd been buried in. I could either grab it or stay suffocating beside a man who thought he'd won. I made my choice. A week later, I joined Naomi's firm. But not as Clarice Mendez. I became Clara Dawson, a name that carried no history, no baggage, no burned past. Naomi understood immediately when I told her I wanted to keep things discreet. She didn't ask for details. She simply nodded, trusting that I had my reasons. For the first time in months, I felt free. The office was full of light, laughter, and the kind of creative energy I'd been starving for. The first day I picked up a sketch pencil again. My hand trembled not from fear, but from a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time: purpose. Naomi was everything a leader should be: supportive yet demanding, warm but precise. She gave me space to rediscover myself. I poured every ounce of emotion into my work. Clients began requesting me personally, saying they felt something different in my designs, something alive, something resilient. They didn't know the secret: that every line I drew carried pieces of my past, that every space I created was a metaphor for rebuilding what had been destroyed. Months passed, and my name, or rather, Clara's name, started circulating in .name design circles again. The firm's success grew rapidly, and Naomi often joked that I'd brought the fire back into her business. I smiled every time she said it, finding the irony delicious. Meanwhile, at home, Derek was unraveling in slow motion. He had no idea that I was working again. He thought I spent my days in recovery, maybe journaling or visiting friends. He'd leave early for his failing ventures, returning late, reeking of whiskey and self-importance. He bragged often about how the insurance payout had set us up for life. He even started talking about buying a boat, something he'd never shown interest in before. It was almost pathetic watching him bask in a success he didn't earn, oblivious to the empire I was quietly building beneath his nose. I listened, nodded, and smiled through dinner conversations, pretending to care while secretly transferring small portions of my salary into a hidden account. Every cent was mine: earned, saved, and protected. Over the next several months, Naomi's firm flourished. Together, we won contracts that other companies only dreamed of. She began trusting me with major projects: high-end hotels, luxury penthouses, commercial spaces with blank canvases that screamed potential. I designed like a woman possessed, my creativity fueled by something deeper than ambition. Every success tasted like quiet revenge. Derek was fading, losing touch with the world he thought he controlled, while I was ascending, piece by piece, into the life he tried to bury. Naomi saw my growth and rewarded it. She called me into her office one afternoon, a sunlit room filled with color boards and architectural sketches, and told me she wanted to make me a partner. "You've earned it, Clara," she said, smiling. I remember staring at her, trying to keep my composure while my heart raced. Partner. The word echoed through my mind, blending pride with defiance. I shook her hand, thanked her sincerely. But what I didn't tell her was that this was only the beginning. At home, Derek noticed my quiet confidence returning, though he didn't understand it. He accused me of being distant, of acting superior. I brushed him off with calm indifference, knowing that the more he questioned me, the closer he came to realizing how irrelevant he had become. He wasn't my husband anymore. He was a shadow, a relic of the person I used to be tied to. Each morning, I left for work with my head held higher, my steps lighter. I told him I was volunteering at an art therapy center, and he believed it, too wrapped up in his illusions to notice the truth right in front of him. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd once burned my art to ashes, and now I was designing spaces that celebrated rebirth and resilience, everything he could never understand. The transformation was subtle at first, then unstoppable. My days were filled with creative brilliance, my nights with strategic planning. I began mapping out what would come next, not for Naomi's firm, but for my own future. I wanted something that was entirely mine again, something no one could ever touch or destroy. Naomi noticed my ambition but mistook it for drive, not vengeance. "You've got the fire back," she said with a grin one evening as we toasted another successful project. I smiled, raising my glass. She had no idea how literal her words were. Within a year, I had saved enough to start something new. The thought took root in my mind and refused to leave. I could feel the timing aligning, the pieces falling perfectly into place. I didn't want to expand Naomi's firm. I wanted to build my own, a creation born from everything I had lost, forged from ashes into empire. Derek had burned my dreams once. This time, I would build something that would burn him. And the first spark of that plan began the moment I realized Naomi's success had simply reignited my own. Revenge tastes best when it's dressed in success. By the time I decided to leave Naomi's firm, my plan had already taken shape with the precision of a perfectly drawn blueprint. I'd spent months quietly building a network of suppliers, architects, investors, and clients who trusted my eye and admired my work. What they didn't know was that behind every meeting, every late-night design session, there was a deeper motive. I wasn't just creating spaces anymore. I was creating a statement. Using the money I'd saved and a few well-placed contacts, I registered my new company under my maiden name, Clarice Vega. It felt poetic to reclaim the name I had before Derek, before the ashes, before the betrayal. I called my firm Phoenix Designs. The symbolism was deliberate, a creature reborn from fire, rising stronger and more radiant after destruction. It wasn't just branding, it was prophecy. The early days were difficult but exhilarating. I rented a small office downtown, nothing grand, just a blank white space with good light and potential. From that modest room, I worked tirelessly, designing until dawn, pitching ideas to investors, and crafting a vision that went beyond aesthetics. Phoenix Designs would represent transformation, taking what was broken and turning it into beauty. Clients connected with that message. They saw in me the same story they wanted told through their spaces: survival, reinvention, strength. The first major project came from a boutique hotel chain that had heard about my work through Naomi's firm. They wanted a renovation that captured resilience and modern rebirth. The coincidence made me smile. I poured everything into that project: metallic tones symbolizing endurance, glass to represent transparency, and upward, flame-like designs that subtly echoed the shape of a phoenix. The result was breathtaking. When the hotel reopened, critics raved about its spirit, calling it a living metaphor for triumph. That review alone brought more clients than I could have imagined. Within months, Phoenix Designs wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Invitations to high-profile events, magazine features, and collaborations with luxury brands flooded in. Every accolade, every interview carried an undercurrent of irony. The woman the world was celebrating as a visionary rebuilder was the same woman her husband believed had been reduced to ashes. I couldn't help but wonder what Derek would think if he knew that the name on the front page belonged to the wife he pitied. To protect myself, I built layers of anonymity into the company structure. The ownership was under a holding entity tied to an attorney I trusted, and public records only listed Clarice Vega. Derek would never connect the dots, not yet. My silence was my weapon. I wanted him to mock me first, to underestimate me completely, so when the truth emerged, it would hit with devastating force. And he did. I'll never forget the evening I saw him on a local business segment, lounging in a studio chair with his smug grin plastered across the screen. The interviewer asked about the rise of Phoenix Designs and how new firms were disrupting the market. Derek chuckled and said, "Trendy names and flashy designs don't make real businesses. Most of these people are chasing attention, not excellence." I watched him from my living room, sipping tea, amused by how confidently he dismissed the empire his own greed had inspired. He didn't realize he was insulting me, his wife, the same woman he once told would never make it without him. The poetic justice was too sweet to rush. I stayed silent, letting him dig his own grave of arrogance while my company climbed higher. The true turning point came when I bought back the land where my old studio once stood. I had the deal done through a shell company, so the seller wouldn't recognize my name. Standing on that property again after so many years felt surreal. The air smelled cleaner, the sky brighter, as if the earth itself had moved on from the fire. I closed my eyes and could almost hear the faint echoes of laughter and paintbrushes, the old life I'd lost. Then I opened them and saw opportunity. That lot would no longer be a graveyard of dreams. It would become the heart of my empire. I hired the best construction team in the city and personally designed the plans for my new headquarters, Phoenix headquarters. Every element carried meaning. The exterior would be wrapped in reflective glass to capture sunlight and turn it into brilliance. The lobby would feature a grand staircase shaped like unfurling wings, and at its center, a sculpture, a phoenix rising from a base of blackened stone, symbolizing rebirth from ruin. I wanted everyone who entered the building to feel the story beneath the architecture, even if they didn't know mine. During construction, I visited the site every morning. I'd stand there in my tailored coat, watching the structure rise from the ashes, brick by brick, steel beam by steel beam. There was something deeply satisfying in seeing physical proof of my survival take shape exactly where my destruction had once stood. Workers didn't know why I sometimes smiled at the ground before walking away. It wasn't pride alone, it was closure taking form before my eyes. Meanwhile, Derek continued his descent into complacency. His business deals were failing, though he masked it with bravado. He spent his evenings watching television, criticizing the success of people he didn't understand, mocking upstarts who had the nerve to dream. Little did he know, one of those so-called upstarts was sleeping just a few feet away, building a kingdom while he sat surrounded by empty bottles and fading relevance. When Phoenix Designs began winning awards, my real name still stayed hidden. Journalists tried to reach the mysterious founder, but I declined every interview, allowing curiosity to grow. It became part of the brand's mystique, a faceless visionary, known only through her work. Each award, each article, added another layer of distance between Clarice the woman and Clarice the symbol, and that distance kept Derek blind. By the time construction on the headquarters was complete, Phoenix Designs was no longer just a business. It was a force. The press called it the rebirth of artistry in modern architecture. I stood outside on the day the sign went up, sunlight catching the metallic letters. Phoenix Designs, founded by Clarice Vega. The sight made my chest tighten with something close to awe. I had done it. From the ashes of betrayal, I'd built a monument to resilience, and soon, the man who'd once destroyed me would be forced to watch it rise higher than his imagination could reach. When the invitations went out for the grand opening, I made sure one of them was delivered directly to our house, addressed in bold letters, to Mr. and Mrs. Derek Mendez. I left it on the counter, knowing he'd open it first. That evening, I came home to find him sitting silently at the table, the glossy envelope in his hands. His face was pale, his eyes flicking over the golden lettering of my name. He said nothing at first. Then, finally, in a low voice I'd never heard from him before, he asked. I didn't answer. I just smiled and walked past him, my heels clicking softly against the floor, each step echoing like punctuation marks in the story of his undoing. The look in his eyes wasn't anger. It was fear. You can't build a future on lies, it eventually collapses. Derek had always been proud of calling himself a businessman, though most of his ventures were stitched together by arrogance and borrowed money. After the insurance payout, he fancied himself an investor, the kind of man who believed intuition mattered more than experience. He poured nearly everything he had into a flashy tech startup run by a 20-something visionary who wore expensive suits and spoke in buzzwords. Derek believed he was buying into the next big thing. I knew better. The moment I saw the name of the company flash on his laptop screen, I started digging. What I found was a hollow promise wrapped in false optimism, a company bleeding money faster than it was earning it. I would have let him crash on his own, but fate handed me an easier route. One of the accountants working for his firm was a quiet woman named Laura. We'd met at a networking gala for local businesses months earlier. She was sharp, discreet, and bored with her job. I made a point to talk to her, to compliment her on her work, and soon enough, we started meeting for coffee under the guise of professional advice. Laura didn't need much persuasion to talk. A few kind words, some genuine interest, and she revealed everything I needed: Derek's spending habits, the mounting debt, the investors growing restless. Every number she shared was another crack in the facade he'd built for himself. I didn't confront him. Instead, I began to work quietly from the shadows, weaving my influence through whispers. I knew the right people, clients, financiers, editors, and it didn't take much to plant seeds of doubt. I heard his company's in trouble. I'd mention casually at events, a subtle tone of concern in my voice. Such a shame. He's trying so hard. The business world feeds on perception more than truth, and it wasn't long before those whispers grew into a storm. Investors began to withdraw, one by one, citing instability and unmet projections. Derek's confident demeanor started to crack. He came home one night with the kind of exhaustion that only failure can bring. He sat at the dining table, tie loosened, eyes unfocused. "Clarice," he said quietly, "I don't know what's happening. Everything's falling apart." His voice trembled, and for a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. Then he reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly. "You're all I've got left," he said. The irony nearly made me laugh. This was the man who had destroyed everything I built and watched me grieve without remorse, now looking at me like I was his salvation. I met his gaze with the perfect mask of concern, the same expression I had perfected over the years. "I'm sure it's just a phase," I said softly. "Maybe you're investing in the wrong direction. You need to take bolder steps, something high risk with high reward." The suggestion was deliberate poison wrapped in comfort. I fed him just enough confidence to push him toward even riskier deals. He trusted me, believing I was trying to help him rebuild, but every decision I encouraged only dug him deeper into his own grave. Meanwhile, Phoenix Designs was flourishing beyond even my expectations. We were dominating the market, taking on projects that once would have been out of reach. Our name became synonymous with sophistication and rebirth. Investors who once worked with Derek now courted me, unknowingly shifting their allegiance from his collapsing empire to my rising one. I watched with quiet satisfaction as his business connections dwindled, his calls went unanswered, and his credibility faded. He didn't realize that the woman he confided in each night was the same one orchestrating his downfall. To the public eye, I was radiant. I hosted charity events under the Phoenix banner, elegant evenings filled with laughter, art, and champagne. The city's elite attended, eager to be seen beside the woman whose designs symbolized perseverance. Derek, of course, wasn't invited. He'd see the photos in magazines, my name printed in glossy letters beside words like visionary and iconic. He never said much about it, but I could feel the tension radiating from him, the envy gnawing at his pride. Every headline about my firm was another reminder that he was being left behind. His ego began to crumble under the weight of his own failures. He started drinking earlier in the day, his charm replaced by bitterness. I watched him spiral quietly, never offering more than a sympathetic glance or a soft-spoken reassurance that things will get better. He'd nod, pretending to believe it, but we both knew the truth. Derek's empire was built on deceit, and deceit doesn't have foundations strong enough to stand. At night, when he'd finally pass out in front of the television, I'd sit by the window of my studio, sketching new designs under the soft glow of my desk lamp. The sound of his labored snoring drifted from the living room, a pitiful reminder of what he'd become. I used to wonder what kind of person I'd have been if the fire hadn't happened, if Derek hadn't betrayed me, but I realized that the woman I'd become was the product of those flames. He'd forged me without even meaning to. The more his world disintegrated, the more mine expanded. I began taking meetings with international partners, extending Phoenix Designs beyond city limits. I appeared on television gracefully, anonymously, always as Clarice Vega, founder of Phoenix Designs. I spoke about perseverance, about transformation, about turning pain into art. I'd look into the camera and think about him sitting at home, probably half drunk, watching the woman he thought he'd destroyed being celebrated as a success. Eventually, his desperation bled into his voice. He started calling old investors, old friends, anyone who would still take his calls. Most didn't. The few who did listened politely, made excuses, and cut ties. He blamed the economy, bad luck, even claimed that someone was sabotaging him. He wasn't wrong, though he'd never guess who. One evening, he staggered into the kitchen, frustration dripping from every word. "Clarice, can't you talk to your design friends? Maybe help me find new clients? You know people. Now." His tone was pleading but edged with resentment. I looked at him for a long moment before responding. "You're stronger than you think, Derek," I said softly. "You don't need my help." The lie tasted sweet on my tongue. He nodded, pretending to believe it, then poured himself another drink. The irony was exquisite. I was watching the same man who had burned my dreams now burn his own future, and I didn't have to lift a finger. Every bad choice he made, every failed deal, every sleepless night was self-inflicted. All I had to do was watch and occasionally nudge him a little further down the path he'd paved himself. But success has a way of drawing light to shadows. The more Phoenix Designs grew, the harder it became to stay invisible. People started connecting dots, speculating about the mysterious founder's background. Rumors swirled, but none close enough to expose me until one careless comment at a gala changed everything. Derek's old business associate mentioned, within his earshot, that Clarice Vega had a story that sounded eerily familiar to mine. That night, Derek came home early. His expression wasn't confusion or disbelief this time, it was something far darker. The puzzle pieces had finally fit together, and the moment he realized who truly owned Phoenix Designs, his rage turned deadly. He couldn't handle that. I rose higher from the fire he lit. The day Derek discovered the truth was the day the last of his composure burned away. It happened quietly, without warning. A mutual acquaintance, a man from the business world we both used to frequent, mentioned my name at a charity event. He told Derek, almost offhandedly, that he'd just signed a contract with Phoenix Designs, founded by a woman named Clarice Vega. The moment he said it, I imagine the blood drained from Derek's face. He must have realized in that instant that the name, the initials, even the symbolism were all too familiar to be a coincidence. I was in my office the next morning when the storm arrived. My staff was busy preparing for a client presentation when I heard the echo of heavy footsteps rushing down the corridor. Before anyone could stop him, Derek burst through the glass doors, his voice booming across the open space. "You think you can hide from me, Clarice?" His eyes were wild, his face flushed with fury and disbelief. My team froze, papers midair, conversations halted mid-sentence. For a moment, I just looked at him, the man who had once stood over the ashes of my studio, smirking, believing he'd won. Now he looked small, desperate, unraveling. He slammed his hand on my desk, shouting that I had stolen his future, that everything I had built was his by right. "You used my money, my connections," he screamed, his voice cracking. "You owe me, Clarice. Give up what's mine." I stood slowly, every inch of me calm, deliberate. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "This," I said, gesturing to the office around us, "was built on what you tried to destroy. You don't own a single piece of it." The silence that followed was heavier than his shouting. My employees stood rooted in place, their eyes darting between us. Without breaking eye contact, I pressed the button on my desk phone and told the receptionist to call security. 2 guards entered moments later. Derek's expression flickered between disbelief and humiliation as they escorted him out. He struggled, trying to pull free, shouting my name as if that would somehow make me change my mind. But I just turned away, my composure unshaken. The last thing he saw before the doors closed behind him was me picking up a file, continuing my work as though he were nothing more than a forgotten interruption. That public humiliation shattered whatever pride he had left. I could sense it in the way the air around him seemed to darken after that day. Within hours, the incident spread through the office gossip chain, then into industry whispers. The husband of Phoenix's founder had a breakdown, they said. Some pitied him, others simply enjoyed the spectacle. I didn't correct the story. Some truths don't need defending, they reveal themselves naturally. For a brief moment, I thought that confrontation might be the end of it. I was wrong. A few days later, the first letter arrived. It was typed, unsigned, filled with venom. The words were simple but heavy with threat. "You think you've won, but this isn't over." I didn't flinch. I had expected this reaction, almost planned for it. The second letter was more personal, mentioning details only Derek would know. The color of my office curtains, the route I took to work. Then, one night, as I was leaving the studio, I found my car tires slashed clean through. I didn't panic. Fear had no power over me anymore. Instead, I took photos, filed a report, and went home. I sat by the window that night, sipping tea as the city lights flickered below, and thought about how full circle it had all become. He'd started with fire, and now he was burning himself from the inside out. That's when I decided it was time to end this, not emotionally, not privately, but legally and publicly. The next morning, I opened the digital folder I had created years ago, the one that held every piece of evidence from his betrayal. The insurance papers, the forged signatures, the emails discussing the incident. Every detail was there, untouched, waiting for the right moment. That moment had arrived. I took the file to the authorities, my statement calm, precise, factual. There was no anger in my voice, only certainty. When the detective asked why I had waited so long, I said, because justice, like art, needs the right timing to make its impact. The investigation moved faster than I expected. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. Derek's name appeared in insurance fraud reports, email trails, and bank transfers that told the entire story. When they reopened the case, I didn't feel triumph. I felt something quieter relief. I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted truth laid bare in the light for everyone to see. The day of his arrest arrived on an unusually calm afternoon. I was at home, sitting by the window in the living room, when I saw the patrol car pull up to the curb. 2 officers stepped out, followed by Derek on the front porch, his posture rigid. I could hear the faint murmur of his voice through the open window, protesting, bargaining, then finally, resigning. Neighbors peeked through their blinds, curious. Cameras clicked, whispers spread. It was poetic in a way, watching the man who had once stood so tall among them now being led away in handcuffs, his head lowered not in humility but defeat. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. There was no satisfaction in the sight, only closure. I stood by the window, my fingers lightly resting on the glass, and breathed deeply. For the first time in years, my lungs filled without the weight of smoke or guilt. I had carried his secret for so long that letting it go felt like shedding an old skin. When the police car drove away, the street fell silent again. I sat down, letting the stillness settle. In that moment, I realized something vital. Revenge had never truly been my destination. It had been the path that led me to freedom. I had taken the very thing he used to destroy me and turned it into my power, my empire, my story. But peace is rarely permanent. Just as I began to believe the fire was finally extinguished, a call came that evening from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was quiet but trembling. It was one of Derek's former associates, someone I barely knew but who clearly knew too much. "Clarice," he said, almost whispering, "you think it's over, but it's not. He's still trying to reach you even from where he is." I didn't respond at first, the sound of my own pulse drowning out his words. I thought of Derek behind bars, his mind twisting, desperate, dangerous, even in confinement. The man who once burned everything I loved had one last spark left, one last game to play. And I realized, as the line went dead, that my story with Derek wasn't finished yet. Some fires refuse to die quietly. I should have known Derek wouldn't go down without trying to scorch the edges of my world one last time. Even from behind bars, he couldn't let go of the obsession, the need to control, to rewrite the story, to make sure that even in ruin, he left a mark. It began with a call. The prison number flashed on my phone one morning while I was reviewing a new design proposal. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Then curiosity won. His voice was different, softer, cracked in places where arrogance used to live. "Clarice," he said, almost whispering, "I've had time to think. I was wrong. Everything." The line was filled with static, yet I could still hear the tremor in his tone. "I know I can't undo what I did, but maybe we can both move on if you drop the charges. I'll leave you alone, I promise. I've changed." For a second, I let the silence stretch between us. I wanted to see if he'd fill it with truth or manipulation. Predictably, he did the latter. He began painting himself as a man broken by regret, a victim of circumstance. He told me he'd found God, that he'd been writing letters he never sent, that he understood now how much pain he'd caused. It might have sounded convincing to someone else, but I'd learned to recognize the rhythm of his deceit. Even his apologies had strategy. "No, Derek," I said finally, my voice calm but unyielding. "You haven't changed. You've just run out of people to lie to." His tone shifted instantly. The softness vanished, replaced by venom. "You think you're safe?" he hissed. "You think you're untouchable because of your little empire? You wouldn't exist without me. I made you. And if I go down, I'll make sure you do too." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat there for a moment, staring at the phone, not in fear but in recognition. That was Derek, the man who couldn't stand to lose, who'd rather drag the world down with him than accept defeat. I knew he wasn't bluffing. The question was what shape his vengeance would take now that he had nothing left but his words. The answer came weeks later. I woke to headlines splashed across glossy pages and glowing screens. Phoenix Designs built on lies. Founder hiding a dark past. Insurance money fueled her empire. The tabloids had feasted on his fabrications, twisting fragments of truth into scandal. Anonymous sources had painted me as a manipulative opportunist, someone who'd staged her own misfortune for profit. The details were specific enough to raise suspicion but vague enough to avoid immediate dismissal. Investors began calling. Some were polite, cautious, asking for reassurance. Others pulled out quietly, citing reputational concerns. Within days, whispers of fraud circled through the same industry that had once celebrated me. My inbox filled with reporters' requests. My office lines buzzed non-stop, and my staff's once steady confidence began to waver. For the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath my empire tremble. But I refused to crumble. Derek had built his life on deceit and collapse. I had built mine on endurance. I wouldn't allow his final act of desperation to define me. I knew the only way to kill rumor was with truth, and truth, when spoken at the right time, could burn brighter than any lie. I called a press conference. No rehearsed statement, no spin, no handlers whispering in my ear. Just me, Clarice Vega, standing under the bright lights in front of a sea of cameras. My heart pounded, but not from fear. I was ready. I looked directly into the lenses and began. "I'm not here to deny my past," I said. "I'm here to own it." Years ago, my studio burned to the ground in what was believed to be an accident. But it wasn't. The man I trusted most set that fire, and for years, I carried the weight of that secret alone. When I rebuilt, I did it not from money or manipulation, but from pain, perseverance, and purpose. Phoenix Designs was born from ashes, and it belongs to no one but me. The room fell silent. Even the reporters stopped typing for a moment. I told them about the evidence, the investigation, the truth of what had happened. Not in graphic detail, just enough to show transparency without vengeance. "Every space I design is about transformation," I said. "I took something that was meant to destroy me and turned it into something that inspires others. That's what resilience looks like." By the time I finished, the air in the room felt electric. Cameras flashed, but no one shouted questions. They didn't need to. The story had rewritten itself in real time. I walked off that stage lighter than I'd felt in years, my voice echoing long after the microphones were turned off. The next morning, the media flipped its script. Headlines shifted from accusation to admiration, the woman who rose from her own ruins. Phoenix founder turns pain into power. Investors returned, some apologetic, others opportunistic. Phoenix Design's name trended globally. Sales doubled within a week, then tripled. People bought not just my designs, but the story behind them, the story of a woman who refused to let someone else's fire define her. Derek's rumors didn't just die, they were smothered under the weight of truth and success. He had tried to tarnish my empire, but instead he amplified its glory. His words evaporated into the noise of applause and admiration. The world didn't see me as his victim anymore. They saw me as his downfall, a living monument to resilience. Still, victory didn't feel like triumph. There was no joy in knowing I'd won. There was only closure, the kind that comes from finishing a story that should have ended long ago. Yet something inside me felt unfinished. His threats, his bitterness, his call, they lingered like smoke after a fire. I needed to face him one last time. Not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. So, a month later, I arranged a visit. The prison walls loomed large and gray as I walked through the gates, the sound of my heels echoing against the concrete. The guard led me into a sterile visitation room divided by a pane of glass. When Derek appeared on the other side, he looked smaller, his eyes sunken, his once proud posture reduced to slouching defeat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he gave a weak smile, not of apology, but of recognition. "You won," he said quietly. I shook my head. "No, Derek, I didn't win. I survived. There's a difference." His gaze darkened, the faint spark of defiance flickering behind his tired eyes. "You think this ends here?" he murmured. "It never ends, Clarice. You and we're bound by the same fire." I rose from my chair, my reflection overlapping with his in the glass, and for the first time, I saw the truth of it, not the bond he imagined, but the separation. He was the fire, and I was the light that rose from it. They're made of the same elements, but they serve different purposes. I leaned forward slightly, my voice steady. "You're wrong. It ends today, and I decide how." Then I turned and walked away, leaving him behind the glass, behind the years, behind the ashes. But as I stepped into the sunlight outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that the last flame hadn't gone out completely, not yet. True revenge isn't destruction, it's transformation. I realized that the moment I walked into the prison to see Derek for the last time. The building smelled of cold, metal and resignation, a place where echoes carried stories no one wanted to hear. I moved through the corridors with steady steps, my heels clicking softly against the polished concrete, the sound sharp and deliberate. The guards nodded, leading me to a small visitation room divided by a glass wall. It was quiet there, sterile, almost too clean, like a place pretending to erase its own sins. When Derek appeared, I hardly recognized him. The man who once stood tall and loud, full of swagger and superiority, was now bent beneath the weight of time and consequence. His hair had thinned, his face sagged, and his once proud eyes were clouded with something that looked dangerously close to regret. His prison uniform hung loosely on his frame, the color dulling his presence even further. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of something, not pity, not sadness, but a kind of detached acknowledgement. This was the ending he had written for himself. He sat across from me, staring in silence for what felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked like brittle glass. "You look different," he said. "Stronger, colder." "I became what you tried to destroy," I replied, my tone measured, not cruel. "You gave me fire. I gave it purpose." He blinked, as if my words were too heavy to process. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the phone on his side of the glass. "Clarice," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for it to go that far. I just wanted you to need me again." That confession, hollow and small, fell flat between us. I stared at him, searching for even a trace of the man I had once loved, but all I saw was the shadow of a person consumed by his own bitterness. There was no redemption here, no apology that could rewind what had been lost. "You didn't want me to need you," I said softly. "You wanted me to break without you, but I didn't. I rebuilt without you." His eyes welled, with something like remorse, but I had long since run out of emotion for him. There was no satisfaction in seeing him weak, no thrill in knowing I'd won. There was only peace, a quiet, steady kind that came from finally understanding that his power over me had ended long before the fire. He just hadn't realized it until now. When the guard announced our time was up, Derek leaned forward, desperation flickering in his eyes. "You'll come back, won't you?" he asked. "You can't just leave it like this." I met his gaze for the last time and smiled faintly. "Yes, I can." I hung up the receiver, stood, and walked out without looking back. As the heavy metal door closed behind me, it was as if the last chain that had bound me to him dissolved into air. I stepped into the sunlight outside, feeling its warmth on my face, and for the first time in years, I felt completely free. The air tasted different, clearer, lighter, like a new beginning. In the months that followed, I poured every ounce of that freedom into expanding Phoenix Designs. What began as a small firm born from survival transformed into a global movement. We opened new offices across continents: New York, Paris, Tokyo, Sydney, each one a beacon of resilience, carrying forward the message that beauty can rise even from ruin. The company's influence grew far beyond architecture. We partnered with foundations, sponsoring art centers for women rebuilding their lives after loss, abuse, or tragedy. Each space was designed with intention: bright windows, open layouts, colors that whispered renewal instead of sorrow. I named the first center Ember House. It stood as a sanctuary for women who needed a place to restart, to find strength and creativity the way I once did. Walking through its hallways filled with laughter, brushes, and the smell of paint, I saw reflections of my younger self, women learning to build again, not in spite of pain, but because of it. That was when I understood the true meaning of legacy. The media called me a symbol of resilience, but I didn't care about titles. I cared about what Phoenix Designs represented, not revenge, but resurrection. My name, Clarice Mendez, became synonymous with transformation. I made the conscious decision to reclaim it publicly, merging both identities, the woman who had survived and the one who had thrived. No longer hiding behind my maiden name, I stood as all of me whole, unafraid, unapologetic. Every project we completed carried a piece of that story. Metallic tones, rising motifs, the interplay of shadow and light, they all told the same truth, that darkness has its place, but it doesn't last forever. Our designs were no longer just buildings. They were reminders of what endurance could look like in physical form. The new Phoenix headquarters became the heart of that message. Built on the same land where my first studio had once stood, it towered against the skyline, glass gleaming like fire caught in daylight. Inside the lobby stood the sculpture I had envisioned years ago, a phoenix ascending from charred stone, wings outstretched toward the sky. Visitors often stopped to admire it, unaware that beneath their feet lay the ashes of everything that once tried to bury me. On the day of the grand reopening, I stood outside the building surrounded by press, colleagues, and the hum of celebration. Cameras flashed, people applauded, but my focus drifted upward to the massive logo gleaming in sunlight, Poetic Designs. It reflected everything I had become. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the day wash over me. In that stillness, memories came rushing back, the fire, the smoke, the betrayal, the ashes. But they no longer hurt. They no longer held me. Later that evening, after everyone had gone, I returned to the front steps alone. The sky had deepened to a soft amber, the last rays of sun glinting off the glass like sparks. I looked at my reflection in the door, saw the strength in my eyes, and whispered the words that had lived inside me for years. You burned my dreams. I built an empire on your ashes, and you watched it rise. The wind carried the words away, soft and final. There was no bitterness in them, only truth. I had spent so long seeking retribution that I almost missed what I had truly achieved, not revenge, but transcendence. Derek had been a chapter, a catalyst, a necessary storm. Without his destruction, I might never have discovered the woman capable of building something indestructible. As night fell, the building lights illuminated the phoenix emblem atop the headquarters. It glowed softly against the dark sky, a reminder that light doesn't always destroy the shadows sometimes. It just learns to coexist with them. That was the real victory. My empire wasn't built on hate anymore. It was built on purpose. My story was no longer about what he took from me, but about what I created from it. And as I walked away from the building that bore my name, I felt the world settling into silence, not the silence of loss, but the peace that follows when a fire has burned long enough to become light. The story didn't end in vengeance. It ended in transformation, the quiet, unshakable power of a woman who turned ruin into rain. In the end, he gave me fire, but I was the one who learned how to control the flames. My empire didn't rise from revenge, it rose from the courage to begin again. He built his life on destruction, while I built mine on rebirth. And as I stand above everything he tried to burn, I finally understand true victory isn't watching someone fall. It's learning how to rise higher than their ashes ever reached. If my story moved you, don't let it fade away here, share it. So someone else remembers that it's never too late to start again. Your support keeps stories like mine alive, so don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more journeys of strength and rebirth. And tell me, if someone burned your dreams to the ground, would you rise from the ashes or let the fire define you?